Good morning. Welcome to our 5th annual Future of U.S.-China Conference. The last time we gathered together in person for this event was 3 years ago on January 15th, 2020. We're so pleased to have everyone in person here today. A lot has happened since then. Through our events and this 8-part Seeking Truth Through Facts series, we've covered the CHIPS Act, semiconductors and security, disrupted supply chains, research collaboration, the Belt and Road Initiative, the audit agreement, and Xi Jinping's third term. Today's conference theme is moving towards the edge, a phrase used by our global CEO, Kevin Rudd, when describing the current U.S.-China relationship. You'll hear from 31 expert speakers throughout the day. Half of them have traveled to Silicon Valley to be with us. On behalf of our honorary chairs, Jack Wadsworth and Ken Wilcox, and our chair, Gary Reichel, our board and advisory council, welcome. Welcome also to consulate representatives. Today we have guests from China, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, India, Indonesia, Singapore, Vietnam, and Hong Kong. Welcome to our members, and a huge thank you to our sponsors. You have printed programs on your tables. Our speaker bios and program are also on our website. We do have press in the room. This event is on the record, and we are recording. We're going to be posting all these videos to YouTube. Just 2 sessions today are going to be available to a hybrid Zoom audience, and lucky you, only the people attending in person are going to be able to ask questions to our speakers. If there is time at the end of each session, and that's going to be up to the moderators, they will ask the audience for a Q&A. If you are called on, please wait for a microphone to be brought to you, and please introduce yourself and keep your question short, because we have a lot of excellent content to get through in a very short day. We do want to hear from you. Audience participation is what makes this event so special. We welcome diverse points of view. We know that we have diverse points of view in the room and on the stage. And as a reminder, our mission at Asia Society is to navigate shared futures. That's the spirit that we would like to keep today, that of building bridges. And with that, let's get started with our first session, Entangled Roots, the U.S., China, and the Evolving Global Trade Order. Please welcome our guest speaker, Wendy Cutler, Vice President of our Asia Society Policy Institute, who is in town from Washington, D.C., and our moderator, Director of Government Affairs and Public Policy at Google, James Green.
All right. Thank you, Margaret. Thanks all for coming. Welcome to Mountain View for those who are traveling from afar. I want to start first by introducing Wendy, a longtime friend and really incredible leader in the trade space. She is the Vice President of the Asia Society Policy Institute. She has over 3 decades of experience in the federal government working at the Department of Commerce and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, which is the agency that negotiates trade agreements. The last job she had was the acting deputy USTR, and she's focused on Asia for almost all of her career. So we're super happy to have her here on stage and, of course, at the Asia Society. We're starting with the most important issue, which is trade, so thank you, Margaret, for kicking us off in the right way. Maybe we could start, Wendy, talking about China's opening up. There's been shifts in the global supply chain since COVID in the last 2+ years. How do you see those shifts in the global supply chain and where China fits in that today, given where China is and where the rest of the trade economy is?
Well, that's a really light question to start with, but first, thanks. It's great being here, and it's great being back on this conference in person. Thanks to Margaret and her team for putting together such a great program. And I guess we're honored to be kicking it off, so we better make this interesting, right?
No doubt.
Okay, so supply chains, China, so much is going on with respect to shifting supply chains. In fact, almost every day when you check your phone and you're reading what's going on in the world, there's another either U.S. or foreign or even Chinese company announcing plans to open a plant somewhere else, sometimes within their home country, but often elsewhere in Asia, Mexico, other places. And I think we're going to continue seeing that. A number of countries, including India, Vietnam, Malaysia, are putting into place a number of incentives to try and attract these shifting supply chains to their countries, either being tax benefits, subsidies, getting rid of red tape, pilot programs, et cetera. And so there is kind of a healthy competition to attract these shifting supply chains. Now, this doesn't mean that all these companies are leaving China. In fact, when you look at data or you look at surveys of companies in China, it's clear that while more are contemplating moving, many are committed to staying in China. But that said, there are a number of challenges with respect to staying in China now, including Chinese regulatory policy and uncertainty, US constraints and regulations, but also, I would argue, the whole COVID lockdown and now the abrupt opening has really raised a lot of questions among executives in terms of being able to operate the way they used to be in China, bringing in their executives, bringing in their workers, and having certainty about their operations, and also certainty about their plants being able to, remain up and running. So, a very dynamic time here. The data is still very new and very, uncertain. It's hard to draw any conclusions, but I suspect we are going to see more and more production move, particularly to Asia. But I would also note that I think Mexico has an enormous opportunity here. The president just met earlier this week with his counterparts from Mexico and Canada, and one of their key agenda items were how to attract more of these supply chains to North America.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. We'll talk a little bit more about that example of how the new NAFTA agreement may help spur a regional agreement that I know you've worked on for the Asia Pacific. And we've got some later panels on. I look forward to hearing Ling Wei in particular on where the Chinese government is on attracting foreign direct investment. There seems to be a bit of a pivot, and so look forward to hearing and Tom and others on kind of where the Chinese government is, and to your point, Wendy, on attracting that. I know one of the issues, in addition to supply chains, or as part of that, has been the Section 301 tariffs that the Trump administration put in on exports from China to the United States. Maybe before we get to some of the more nitty-gritty issues about trade policy, if you could just share your views on where the administration is on those tariffs. Some of them are up for a 4-year renewal that's required by statute, the first tranche now, and then they'll be coming in the next few months. How do you see where the administration is on those tariffs, and is there some chance that they may be rescinded or be dropped?
Well, if anyone in the audience is waiting for those tariffs to be lifted, I would say don't hold your breath. I think they are here to stay for the foreseeable future. Last year, there was an effort by the administration to start thinking about rebalancing the tariffs, not lifting them, but increasing the rates on those products that were hurting China more and decreasing or eliminating the tariffs on a basket of goods that were hurting the US more. That policy, interagency policy, those deliberations never reached conclusion. The last we heard for months is the decision was on the president's desk. But then what happened was that Congress became very critical of even rebalancing tariffs, trying to point to the administration as being soft on China if indeed they didn't keep these tariffs in place. So that's the kind of policy environment that the administration finds itself in. And it is unfortunate because many of these tariffs, frankly, are hurting the US either more or as much as China. So that's number one. Number two, you did refer to a process that is underway, led by our previous home agency, the Office of the US Trade Representative, and that is a statutorily required review under Section 301, the legal authority that let these tariffs be put in place. And what the statute says is that after 4 years, these tariffs should either sunset, go away, but if anyone comes in and says they're still effective, they should remain. So USTR now is collecting that information. I would say this is a very slow-moving process. I believe the comments are due in the middle of this month. And then once they get all of this input, they'll sift through it. And the question is, as a result of their deliberations, will they propose some rebalancing or just some outright tariff elimination? My hunch is that things will there may be some tweaks, but that for the most part, these tariffs will remain in place up until the next presidential election.
Right, so at least 2 more years. Great, thanks, Wendy. And one of the things that the tariffs brought forward, that the Trump administration put in place, that the Biden administration kept, was whether or not the United States is playing by the rules of the World Trade Organization in imposing those unilaterally. Recently, the U.S. lost a case at the WTO on a separate tariff imposition on steel and aluminum, and China has been positioning itself as a defender of the global system in the WTO and accusing the United States of wrecking the global system. How do you see that? What's happening in Geneva, and how are the two capitals, Washington and Beijing, kind of positioning themselves there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a great question, and it's very topical because the U.S. recently lost a WTO dispute settlement case on the steel and aluminum tariffs that were imposed by President Trump under the guise of Section 232, which was a national security based statute. And the panel basically came out and found the U.S. in violation. The U.S. responded with a very terse and very straightforward press release saying basically, thank you very much, not interested, we intend to keep these measures in place. And then about 3 weeks later, there was another case. This was on the U.S. Response to developments in Hong Kong when the United States requested that any products coming from Hong Kong be marked made in China, not marked made in Hong Kong. And Hong Kong took the United States to the WTO. We lost that case as well. The United States, again, used the national security justification, and the panel basically found against the United States. And the United States then issued another press release saying, well, thank you very much, but we'll decide what's in our own national security, and we're going to keep these restrictions in place. And so the combination of those two disputes, as well as international concern about the consistency of the Inflation Reduction Act with U.S. WTO obligations, has kind of led to kind of a swell of concerns around the world, in the United States as well, among free traders, that the United States is no longer interested in the rules-based system, that it just is going to do what it sees fit. And at the same time, China, in a WTO meeting where the U.S. overall policies were scrutinized recently, China took the microphone and called the United States the rule breaker and the force that was really disrupting the rules-based system. And so there is a lot of criticism aimed at the United States right now. But I think we all just need to keep in mind that the WTO rules are outdated, and efforts to update them have really not succeeded. An organization with 164 countries, including China, India, lots of other countries, has made it very difficult to reach consensus to update these rules, whether it be on non-market economy practices, whether it be on e-commerce, whether it be on environmental rules. And so, if in my view, the United States can still support a rules-based system, but the rules need to be updated. And if they're not updated, I think more and more we're going to see the United States, as well as other countries, be left with no alternative but to basically go their own way. And unfortunately, that's kind of the predicament the World Trade Organization finds itself in in right now. And I would just add that, and I know there's going to be a panel maybe right after ours on the recent semiconductors and recent U.S. restrictions on semiconductors. China is suing the WTO on that measure in the WTO. I think it's probably likely that a panel is going to find the United States justification under national security. I assume that's the justification the United States will give, also as inadequate.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. Good call out on the Hong Kong case. Hong Kong, of course, joined the WTO when it was a British Crown colony and is its own WTO member, and as such, under WTO rules, should be treated different than the PRC, and this case kind of brought those issues to light. There's been frustration, I would say, with the U.S. administration since at least the Obama administration with different parts of the WTO, and you're talking about some of the real challenges that are there. If the WTO is not the place for global trade liberalization, which kind of it had been since it was founded in 1995 and before that under the GATT, that's where a lot of the global trade liberalization happened. If the WTO is too stuck, you were kind of hinting in your answer there, regional trade agreements are kind of the way to go. You guys wrote this great paper about the U.S. Reconsidering coming back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership. China has applied for membership in now the CPTPP. Could you talk a little bit about, this is I'm giving you 3 or 4 different things to kind of chew on, but kind of where, I wanted to hear your guys' analysis of what the U.S. might be able to get by joining the TPP and considerations you put out in your paper, but also on kind of where China is positioning itself in regional trade agreements with the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership and with the CPTPP.
Yeah.
I'll just wind you up and you can go.
Okay. Well, I'll start and then you're going to remind me about all the pieces of your question. Well, first, James referred to a paper that the Asia Society we just put out with a roadmap of possible revisions to the TPP that could be made to facilitate a U.S. re-entry into the agreement. Now, discussion of that topic so far in Washington has been very polarized. Some people say we should rejoin the agreement. Other people say forget it. This agreement is not in our interest. It wasn't initially. It's not now. And this is not the way we should go. And in our paper, what we try to do is to move that conversation, because if we were to ever reconsider rejoining the TPP, the current agreement as is outdated. It doesn't reflect technological developments. It doesn't reflect a lot of global developments about income inequality, and it doesn't reflect a lot of the politics in the United States. And it also doesn't benefit from a lot of the novel approaches to trade that were adopted in the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, but in other agreements in the region as well. And so we came up with a list of 12 areas where the U.S. could seek revisions. And in putting this paper together, we consulted widely in the United States, both with progressives and hardliners, people who supported the TPP, other people who didn't. And we tried very hard to reflect as much of that input as possible. And interestingly enough, we also consulted with CPTPP members unofficially, and we weren't negotiating with them. And I was kind of struck with the really positive reception that we heard from CPTPP countries that very much want the United States back into the agreement. Now, we didn't go through each of our 12 recommendations and whether they could stomach them, but overall the sense was that they were open to changes. In fact, they're thinking of revisions among themselves, recognizing that the deal is outdated. So sometimes in the future, maybe all these forces would align for us to rejoin. But at the same time, there are a number of countries and a number of economies, including China, that have formally applied to join the TPP. Right now, the TPP members are focused on accession by the United Kingdom. This accession process was aimed to be completed by the end of last year. It is continuing to this year. I suspect by the first quarter there will be at least an agreement in principle. And after the UK accession issue is behind the CPTPP members, I think then they will need to turn to these other applications, both from China, Taiwan, and a number of Latin and Central American countries. China has actively now been courting and urging certain CPTPP members to support their entry, and some have been publicly supportive of China joining. Others have been more wary about China joining. And how this plays out during the coming year, when New Zealand will be chairing the process, remains to be seen. But it's going to be very complicated and very difficult, particularly given the applications by China and Taiwan. And how do you deal with both of those, particularly in this geopolitical environment?
Super helpful, yeah. And you mentioned New Zealand. New Zealand has had this complex trading relationship with China in which a large portion of their agricultural exports go to China. I would just say, as someone who was at the embassy in Beijing dealing with trade issues till 2018, the person who probably had the best access of the OECD economies was my New Zealand counterpart. She got to hang out all the time with our Chinese counterpart at the Ministry of Commerce, and they became close personal friends. And New Zealand has this kind of brokering role, or sees itself as a brokering role between China and some other economies. So to your point, it'll be very interesting to see kind of how they handle it.
Yeah, I think 40% of New Zealand's trade is with China, and it's, a big dairy market. If you ever negotiate with people from New Zealand, the officials, it's always about dairy. They also have an FTA, both with China and Taiwan, concluded now about 20 years ago. But that said, New Zealand is, when you look at, they adhere to the rules, they take the rules seriously. And so I think as chairman, it's going to be a difficult year. And in many ways, they'll probably hope that the conversations will continue to the year after, when I believe Canada's in the chair for the CPTPP.
That would be a very interesting relationship. The Canada-China relationship has gone through its ups and downs. I wonder if on your recommendations, one of the things you mentioned, and it's kind of in the news all the time, I wonder if we could just do a little bit of a detour on the rules of origin issue. Not to spend hours and hours on it. It is one of these things in trade that is incredibly important politically for every jurisdiction, but I think it's not really understood. And since we have you as a trade expert on the stage, and if you could just talk through a little bit on what it is and how USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, kind of address some of that, simply because it came up also with the Biden plan on the Tariff Reduction Act and electric vehicles, and what the governments can do to preference their own economies. And so, could you just touch a little bit on what is rules of origin and why does it matter, and then kind of touch on the politics of it a little bit?
Sure, and I can say during my career in trade, the issue of rules of origin has become probably front and center in terms of trade agreements. Some of the most important outcomes are now in how rules of origin are treated. And just to show you, when I first started my career at USTR, and I was obviously a lot younger, I was given the negotiating mandate to negotiate rules of origin. At that time, it was the GATT, and no one else wanted to do it. It was so obscure, no one thought it had any impact. And so I've been working on those issues through the years, and one of my last jobs at USTR was to negotiate the automotive rules of origin for the TPP. An area of the TPP that was under enormous criticism, but we had enormous pressure from our trading partners. Why rules of origin are so important is because trade agreements give benefits to those countries that are part of the agreement, right? But the benefits are given to products. And so it's really important to define, well, what makes a US product? What makes a TPP product? Is it any product that any production in any country of the TPP? No, you want to make sure that there is substantial production of that product in one of the countries that are party to the agreement. And so in the US, Mexico, Canada agreement, the rules of origin negotiations, particularly for autos, became really the linchpin of the deal. And in that agreement, the parties agreed that 75% of all inputs into a car had to be made in one of the three countries. That's a very, very high percentage when you think that there are like over 10,000 parts to a car. It's very hard to track all of this, number one, but it's a very high bar. And as you can conclude, it leads companies then to invest in one of those three countries, because then they can show that those parts are from one of those countries. And if we were to ever return to TPP, I think we would need to seek much higher percentage, what's called regional value content for autos and other products. And getting back to kind of the discussion today, one of the key criticisms of rules of origin, if you're saying 50% of the product needs to be made in one of the parties to the agreement, by definition, that means 50% can come from elsewhere. And so there's a lot of concern that in these agreements, if 50% can come from China, then they're basically like a free rider onto the agreement. And so that's put a lot more pressure on trying to get this percentage regional value content up in agreements. One of our recommendations in our Asia Society paper is to put a cap on how the percentage that can come from non-market economies. And that's something that I think there would be a lot of interest in if we were to return to the agreement.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. And non-market economies being centrally planned economies and designated as such usually by the countries that are involved in the agreements. In the cases of the Asia-Pacific, Vietnam and China come to mind. Can we get back? Thank you very much for the discussion on rules of origin. Again, I think it's the sort of thing that is incredibly technical, but it really is what drives a lot of the negotiation. And for companies that are considering what their supply chain should be like and how to make their global product come to a certain price point, figuring out what the rules of origin are just incredibly, incredibly important.
And I would say some companies decide they don't even want the preference of this agreement, because having to keep track of where all your parts are from is, can incur significant costs for a company.
Right, it can be very burdensome, and depending on the value of those items, may not be worth getting those benefits. Exactly right. Could we, since this is a conference on China, could we move that discussion to the U.S.-China bilateral kind of trade negotiations and kind of where they are or where they aren't? When you and I were at USTR, a lot of time spent preparing for meetings with our Chinese counterparts, trying to get some progress to help U.S. companies, U.S. service providers, U.S. producers to get better market access. There's been, because of COVID and other political reasons, not a whole lot of engagement at the kind of trade negotiator level. How do you see that changing or not changing in the next 6 to 12 months in terms of government-to-government engagement on these issues of market access or challenges for American companies in the China market?
Yeah, when I think about our two governments getting back to the table to try and negotiate on trade, I see very limited prospects for success. I look at the Phase 1 agreement, and I remember that when that agreement was made public, actually it was, I think, 3 years ago, and we got that agreement became available during this conference. And so people like me were just scrolling through the 100 pages of agreement. I think what the Phase 1 agreement just brought home to me, that even with all of those threats with respect, not just threats, but imposition of tariffs, that the deal made basically incremental progress in a lot of areas. That even with all of that damage and all of that, affecting all of that trade, the two sides were unable to really kind of crack the nut on some of these really, sticky issues like subsidies, state-owned enterprises, forced technology transfer. So I think engagement is good, don't get me wrong, and I think we should be engaging with China. Our trade officials should be meeting and working through issues. But in terms of sitting down and trying to negotiate market opening, writ large, I think those days are kind of behind us. And so we see the administration spending less time or no time with China, more time with our allies and partners, trying to basically come up with collective approaches to the policies that China is imposing. Just today, I was reading this morning in the Financial Times that the European Union has now issued their new subsidies tool, which will allow them to go after subsidies and industrial subsidies by countries all around the world. In many respects, this is aimed at China and allows them then to kind of restrict government market access or other participation in government programs if a good is subsidized. So I think more and more you're going to see allies and partners working together to respond to these issues versus trying to come up with new rules that we can sit down and negotiate on with China.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that's right. And I was going to ask you.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, you may. I think that's right. I was going to ask you on that kind of broader question of differences between the Biden administration and the Trump administration. In some ways, much of the China policy around semiconductors or export controls is quite similar, if a bit more rule-bound. But where I think there's a huge difference is their efforts to work with friends and allies on building these networks of issues, particularly around technology, to hem in Chinese technological development by new export controls with allies or figuring out what the new rules should be, as you say, not directly negotiating with China. You spent a lot of time on Japan, with Japan. How do you think those in the region, Japan and others, feel about how the U.S. is positioning itself? And are they on board with this approach? Is it something where they kind of do it tentatively? How do you assess how the administration's effort has been to circle the wagons and work with allies, in some ways in a concerted effort against China?
Well, I think overall successful, but it's still a work in progress. The administration launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. 13 other countries from the region joined, which I think is very positive. You don't see the word China in any of the documents or any of the proposals that are being discussed. I think the administration has done a good job in kind of portraying this initiative in an affirmative sense, the values, the vision, and our objectives for the region, and working with countries on supply chains, decarbonization, digital trade, all in an effort to kind of promote our vision of how these rules should be shaped. So that's number one. But number two, I think it's very clear that many countries in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region, they do not want to choose between the U.S. and China. So while they're participating in IPEF, and some of them enthusiastically, some of them a little more skeptical, they're also going ahead and reaching deals with China, working with China on business deals, on supply chain cooperation. A lot of them, 15 countries, are members of RCEP. China has started accession negotiations to the Digital Economy Partnership Agreement, which is a regional digital agreement. China just announced it wants to update the US-ASEAN FTA, which presumably will lead to more market access for ASEAN. And so I think we're going to see many more efforts by China, and we're already seeing them, but I think 2023 is going to be the year of the so-called charm offensive in an effort to try and bring some of our allies and partners more into the economic orbit of China. I mean, for most of these countries, China's already their largest trading partner. So what do I mean, more into their economic orbit? I mean exactly what I mean. China's filling the void. We're not there at the table making the rules. That's what China's trying to do now. And so we have, by, the nature of our own domestic politics and how we are dealing with trade issues, China has seen an enormous opportunity, and they are, full steam ahead.
Now, one of the regional fora that I know you spent a lot of time on when you were at USTR, and that has both the United States and China in it, is Apec, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. And this year, the U.S. is hosting that. San Francisco will be hosting the leaders meeting in November. So don't drive around the city of San Francisco for whatever those days are in November for that. But I wonder what you see that as an opportunity both for the United States and for the U.S. and China. Traditionally, there's a number of ministerials that lead up to it. There's also the leaders meeting in which presumably Xi Jinping will come here for that. And so how do you see APEC in a regional and then a bilateral context playing out for the rest of this year?
Yeah, well, I think our hosting of APEC this year offers enormous opportunities for the United States to advance an agenda for the region on the economic front, but also to kind of showcase the United States' commitment to the region. There'll be a lot of different ministers coming throughout the year to the United States at a lot of different locations around the country. I will note that while other ministers will be meeting in Seattle, Palm Springs, San Francisco, the trade ministers will be meeting in Detroit. So I think, again, there are enormous opportunities. Bringing it back to this conference, I think that there are important opportunities for the United States and China to work together in APEC this year. We have overlapping interests, particularly with respect to matters like food security, preparing for the next pandemic, and some of the climate issues. So I hope that we can see this cooperation, that it kind of stays kind of low-key under the radar. But I'm hopeful that with Xi Jinping presumably coming here next November, that China will also have a stake in having a successful meeting then and looking like a good partner in APEC. So, well, I don't see the utility of like sitting down and hammering out another trade agreement with China on a bilateral basis. I think working together in organizations like APEC, I would also even say the World Trade Organization, there are areas where we see eye to eye with China, and we are working with them together. But again, it's under the radar screen. We're quiet about it. But I think those type of relationships and cooperation is something that we can hopefully see achieve some success this year.
Yeah, I think it's a good call out about how sometimes the multilateral organization allows for cooperation in a way that bilateral doesn't. Fewer cameras that are present, able to actually work on substantive things. That makes it super helpful. We probably have one more question I'll have for you, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I guess I would ask, you've been in this business for a long time. There's been a fair number of ups and downs. In some ways, there's a fair amount of stability now that we have these tariffs in place, that the Chinese government has decided that their economic system is one that they want to kind of double down on. You had mentioned you didn't really think that right now negotiation between the U.S. and China is kind of in the cards for market access. I guess I'd be interested to hear your view on kind of a bit longer term. Where do you think the Chinese economy will really end up having to grow if it's going to meet the needs the leadership has set out with both its partners and with the United States, which is an incredibly important investor and trading partner?
So clearly the Chinese economy is facing enormous challenges now. And even once they get through COVID and the COVID opening, let's not forget all the other challenges they face. And I'm sure other speakers will be getting into this, whether it be real estate or the private sector crackdown or an aging population or youth unemployment. There are a lot of challenges, and that's not to even mention the external challenges, which include shifting supply chains, include export controls, include other regulatory restrictions that will be coming out of Washington in the coming year, particularly with the Republicans in control of the House. And so, unfortunately, what I see is like a drive by China to become more self-reliant at a time when the United States, with its allies and partners, are trying to also become more self-reliant. So I think there's just going to be a drive around the world for this self-reliance, but also an effort by everyone to diversify trade partners. And we're seeing a lot of that in the region. Everyone's trying to hedge and to enter into more trade agreements, with the exception of the United States, in order to build up those kind of trading relationships, particularly with respect to strategic and essential goods.
Well, great. We've got some time for questions. If we have some folks around with microphones, people could raise their hand and just say their name and their question into the microphone, that would be great. Go ahead.
Can't see anyone.
Hello, Tim Heron, Creative Strategies and Forbes. In the earlier comments, the earliest comments you had was about shifting supply chain and a lot of companies moving out of China, Wendy. Dell, for example, who's the third largest manufacturer of PCs, has literally moved all manufacturing over to Vietnam. And I'm seeing a huge shift on that. How does China navigate that issue when they're losing so many manufacturing jobs, which are very youth-oriented?
Well, part of it, even without COVID and without a lot of the, geopolitical tensions, these shifting supply chains take place over time, because China over time is not, no longer kind of the low-cost economy. But it does offer enormous benefits to companies with respect to supply chains. There's a reason it's the hub for supply chains, as companies will tell me, between all the great infrastructure, the workers, all the parts suppliers in different communities, it's a great place to do business if everything else is going well, while when they move to a Vietnam or an India, they face, other challenges. So we're also seeing, interestingly enough, Chinese companies moving to Southeast Asia, or at least moving some of their production in an effort to also hedge their bets, but to escape the tariffs as well. Again, we see a lot of anecdotes and we see a lot of announcements by different companies in terms of what they're doing. A number of companies are just really quiet about what they're doing too. They don't want to bring attention to the fact that they are leaving China in fear of retribution. We're seeing an enormous effort by China to continue to talk about the importance of supply chains, accusing the United States of trying to kind of break these supply chains, or to decouple, or to come up, or to try and develop, its own supply chains. But I think if China wants to continue to be such a major hub, I think that argues for more market opening, more trade facilitation, and more certainty, and fewer regulations. And I don't know. We can discuss that all day. I don't think that's the trend right now.
Yeah, well, it'd be interesting to hear what other panels have to say. I think the Chinese government's kind of policies on manufacturing are very strong, but as you know, they've been trying to move up the value chain, and so for lower end manufacturing, not that interested in it, less assistance to manufacturers. And the question of, are PCs on the higher end or the lower end? I think you could probably kind of debate what sort of manufacturing that is, but I think that's the balance that the central leadership has to, and local governments have to decide is this bit of manufacturing the sort of thing that we want to invest time and effort into, or is that really something that for footwear production, that's fine to move to Vietnam or somewhere else? In the back.
Thank you. Morning, James and Wendy. My name is Lee Song from Silicon Valley Bank. SVB, as you know, is the go-to bank for technology companies, VC funded. When I pulled my clients before coming to the meeting, asked them, hey, what's your top concern for 2023? The word recession is top of the list. So my question is, with the looming recession for the US and major economies in the world, and also the slowdown for the global economy, what kind of challenges or opportunities will that present to the US-China relationship? Thank you very much.
Would you like to start?
One or you?
Sure. Lisa, great to see you. Thanks for the question. I think in this discussion we had a little bit earlier about Apec providing an international fora for the US and China to discuss things at a kind of tactical level, I think in some ways a macroeconomic slowdown is an opportunity for our financial and macroeconomic agencies to talk to each other through the G20 and through other fora that they should be doing. That is, both the US and China are very large economies, and you'd want to make sure that whatever fiscal or monetary measures are being put forward in one country has some, at least, calibration with what the other is doing. So at a kind of policy level, no one wants an economic slowdown, but I do think it does offer an opportunity for that sort of discussion, as well as the US will have with other major economies in the world. I think for a kind of investor or which parts of the economy are going to do well sort of question, which I think was underlyings of it, I think it's really hard to tell. When consumer sentiment goes down, a lot of the trade that happens across the Pacific is around consumer goods. And so when that dries up, that means less consumer goods going across the Pacific. I mean, I guess the one area that comes to mind is, services have done well once the pandemic kind of allowed us to reopen. And so that is one area that may do quite well, even if the good trade dips down with slowing economic growth.
I would just add that exports for China has been one kind of shining light in terms of their economy in the past few years. But when you look at China's trade data for the past few months, you see both exports and imports declining. And that, I think, is going to even put more pressure on China in terms of trying to achieve economic growth. And not to be the downer, you mentioned that this offers an opportunity for bilateral macroeconomic cooperation. During my career, during recessions, what I've always seen is the increase in protectionism and kind of less policy space for U.S. administrations to do anything that would further contribute to a recession or hurt workers or somehow damage our economy. So it could lead economies to almost become more inward-looking.
Yeah, fair point.
Hi, I'm Jacko Zhang, Hong Kong Economic and Trade Office. I'm wondering, you have addressed a lot of the trade concerns and priorities of merchandise trades or products, but for software companies or internet services or apps, China has its own companies, and US companies often are not able to access the market. An example is Google, of course. And I'm wondering, what is the US government's policy or priorities in terms of trying to gain market access for these for US companies in the software or internet services space? Thank you.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I would say to Wendy's earlier point, I think the larger ministerial venues that we had government to government wise, those really aren't there anymore. I would say our interactions with the US government is we often present market access challenges, not only in China, but in plenty of markets around the world. And then the US government will decide which is the right venue to kind of push that. I think for the stepping back and putting on my hat as a former US government official, I think we've the number of places to do that for the US government is really dried up. And so, sure, there are agricultural interests, there are market access interests for technology companies. I just think for the US government, pushing market access with China now is just not high on their agenda. Wow. Well, thank you all for coming today. Glad to see our numbers have increased over the last 40 minutes. Hopefully, we all learned something about trade and where China fits into it and rules of origin. There'll be a quiz later. Thank you, Wendy, for walking us through all that. Thanks to Margaret and the Asia Society for hosting us, and look forward to the rest of the conference.
Thank you, James and Wendy. It felt like we took one step towards the edge, maybe one step back, and we're still on the edge. If you can exit this way, that would be great. Thank you again for that trip around the world. And we do have representatives from a bunch of countries in Asia, and we would like to hear from you if you have commentary, feedback, or questions.